Hello, and welcome to our webinar on the topic of what value does Supplier Information Management, or SIM, create. I'm your host, Duncan Clark, and this is the third in our series of webinars on the subject of end-to-end SIM strategy. Previously, we covered how to build the business case and implementation, but today we turn our attention to outcomes, considering the business benefits and the value add that's created by effective supplier information management. For this discussion, we've got two terrific examples in EDF and BAE systems. So I'm delighted to welcome Adam Hubbard, Supply Chain Governance and Performance Manager at EDF, and Jerry Grable, Director, E-Business at BAE Systems, alongside Kostas Xiloyani, CEO of HICS. So welcome to the panel, and it's great to have you all here today. Adam, if I could start with you, could you tell us a bit more about your role at EDF and your background?
Yeah, sure. So I'm relatively new into EDF. I joined in July last year. So I've done a number of things from contract buying through to process and systems and governance now at EDF. If anybody doesn't know, EDF is one of the largest UK and international energy providers. We're one of the market leaders in low carbon sustainable energy with a mix of traditional nuclear and renewables generation. And as I say, I joined last year into the corporate and customers business unit supply chain team. And my role is to look after governance and performance. So that translates to the processes, the policies, and the systems that our supply chain use. And that includes obviously supplier onboarding and supplier management. And for us, supplier management is one of the few systems and processes that we have that goes truly across all of our business units. So it's quite key to what we do.
Well, that leads me very nicely to my next question. Why is SIM so important to you at EDF, and what are some of the problems it can help to fix?
So EDF is quite a complex organisation. And as I say, I'm still trying to get my head around it at the moment. In effect, in the UK, it's sort of 5 different businesses. So we've got the corporate and the customers business units, which is where I sit. Obviously, the customers looks after our supply and billing, etc., to our customers' business. Corporate is very much a central organisation that supports the rest of the business. And then we get the generation business unit. Obviously, that is the part of the business that generates electricity and gas for our customers. And we've got 2 major construction projects, which is at Hinkley Point C and a future project, Sizewell C, which will be our new nuclear builds. And in effect, what we have is 5 different businesses doing actually very different things. So from a supply chain perspective, we have different supply chain teams in each of those business units that look after a very different business. And I mentioned earlier that HICS, which is obviously our supplier onboarding system and supplier management system, is one of only 2 systems that we use in supply chain that is properly embedded across all of those 5 different businesses. And one of the reasons that's really important for us is managing the different suppliers and certainly the risk that goes alongside those different suppliers, which, as you would imagine, is very different depending on which business unit you're in. Health and safety, for example, in our nuclear generation business is a very different proposition to health and safety in our customers' business. So we use a central system, we use HICS to make a very consistent onboarding experience for our suppliers, but really focusing on what's important within each of those business units. And that's why it's really key for us to have a central system that's managed consistently across all of our suppliers.
And the same question to you, Jerry. So first of all, welcome to the panel. Could you tell us a bit more about your role at BAE Systems and your background?
Yeah, so hello to you all. I am Jerry Grable, the Director of E-Business for BAE Systems, Inc. I am responsible for supply chain automation and e-tools for our US market. So BAE Systems is a global aerospace and defense contractor. We have 5 key markets around the world, and I am responsible for supply chain automation for the US market. BAE Systems is very similar to what Adam had mentioned. I mean, BAE Systems is a company of acquisitions. I've been with BAE for about 25 years. I actually started in supplier quality, worked into procurement, got into procurement systems. And then about 17, 18 years ago, BAE started to get serious about its digital journey, its digital strategy. And I led a team at the time looking at starting to deploy, e-commerce to be able to electronically collaborate with our supply chain. So I lead a team within the US that basically works with each of our business units. We have 10 business units in the US, working to consolidate, catalog our process and procurement tools, and look for opportunities to embed automation and digitization, et cetera. Our journey with Hicks started, about 8 years ago, when we saw a need to actually start doing supplier management. BAE, up until our deployment of Hicks, really didn't do supplier management. As Adam had mentioned, supplier management is one of the few processes that we have that actually encompasses all of our business units. So it was in this cataloging of procurement process and procurement tools where we kind of discovered everyone's doing supplier management, one, in a very manual way through email, but two, due to the fact that there's not a single system that executes it, or there's no coordination amongst the business units. Suppliers are having to submit and manage their information multiple times. So it was kind of in that review that we decided this is something that BAE really need to focus on. And that kind of led us down the path of Hicks.
And Kostas, a question to you then. Are these some of the most common issues that you hear about? Is it the same across all sectors, or are there differences in other sectors? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would say, look, the challenges are probably similar across sectors. We are seeing that many have a struggle with multiple supplier-facing systems, potentially different systems used by different business units as well. So the idea of trying to unify an experience for their suppliers and also provide control and manage an end-to-end, which is what both Adam and Jerry have described. It's not just necessarily procurement, right? It's really going across the business who request and use the suppliers to quality, to all of these different functions.
So my next question to you, Adam, would be around some of the core use cases that you've briefly described. What are the major benefits that SIM brings?
Okay, so when I joined EDF, one of the things that became quite apparent to me is that actually supply chain as a function has managed to put themselves right at the core of all this, which is not always the case in my experience, and is really important and key to what we do at EDF. It's very easy to believe that you have a very good view of the supply chain in your organization, and that's not always the case, because people like to go off and do their own deals, like to go and find their own suppliers, etc. But one of the things I've inherited coming into EDF is a properly engaged supply chain team, and that's been enabled because of Hicks. So in our process, any new supplier that gets onboarded, first of all goes to supply chain to see, do we need a new supplier in this area? Do we have agreed supply lists already? And then if it is agreed that actually they do something that's a little bit different, then we kick in the supplier onboarding process, and we ask the supplier for some information. We ask our internal stakeholders for some information. And then as far as the risk assessments go, whilst supply chain have some of the answers, we don't necessarily have the really in-depth knowledge that we need in order to assess these things. So what we've been able to produce in HICS, which is really putting us in a very good place, is the ability to bring in those specialist risk teams, data risk team, the credit risk team, the financial crime assessment team, and sanctions. So we use HICS to coordinate their input into this process, so that as the supplier onboarding process goes through and then comes back to supply chain to say, okay, so now we've done the due diligence, we've investigated the supplier, and these are the results of those assessments. Those SME teams, those specialist teams, are able to provide information to the supply chain specialist to say, okay, so we've done a check, this is what we found in that check, and these are our recommendations on how you should view this. So they're not taking responsibility for the risk, but they are providing us with the right information for supply chain and the business owner to make those decisions in an informed way with the right information. And that's become really key to us, to be able to provide that information to the supply chain team. So that's one of the real core cases that we're seeing, and one of the many benefits in using HICS to control this. Because fundamentally, if the supplier doesn't go through the HICS process, they don't get set up into our ERP system, which means we don't raise a purchase order, which means we're not paying invoices.
And Adam, you mentioned data there. So what impact does having a single view of data have? And what are some of the associated benefits from this perspective?
So as I said earlier, HICS is one of only 2 systems that we use truly across the board. We have other systems specifically used in other business units. So for example, contract management, the contract database, we've got different systems in different business units. So trying to get our arms around all of those contracts and really understand how many contracts we've got in place, what value, what their renewals are, all that sort of stuff is difficult in EDF. We don't have a consistent one platform approach to all of that, but we do with suppliers. So with suppliers, as I say, we can actually run reporting that shows us which suppliers we have and which suppliers are able to work for which business unit. So in our supplier structure, we have suppliers at the master level, so we understand how many suppliers there are, and then in effect we onboard them for each of the business units, and they go through the risk assessment specific to that business unit. So in effect, we're licensing that supplier to work within the generation business unit or the Hinkley Point C business unit. And that's really key for us to be able to manage that. And some of the other practical benefits that we have, so for example, when COVID became a big thing, this time last year, we used HICS to send out communications to all of our suppliers as to what our approach was for COVID, what was happening on our sites, the relationship that we needed to have with our suppliers in that new COVID situation. And we were able to send out communications through HICS to our supplier base very easily, because we already had that single database of our suppliers and their contact details.
Well, certainly the whole situation with COVID is a great example of where this can really come into action. So, Jerry, a similar question to you, perhaps either in the context of COVID or more generally. What are some of the big wins that you've experienced as a result of implementing SIM?
Yeah, so it's a lot of it's very similar to what Adam had just mentioned. I mean, one, BAE uses HICS as our supplier qualification tool. So this was the original deployment of HICS was to digitize supplier onboarding and centralize, all the information that we house around our suppliers. BAE being in the, DoD and aerospace industry, we have a number of certifications that we need to produce, in our various audits throughout the year. Prior to HICS, that information was collected manually. It was stored, across our business units in multiple locations. It was hard to reproduce when, we had audits. With HICS, having all of the requirements predefined workflows, as we send suppliers through this onboarding process, that information is collected, it's verified, and it's preserved. So when we have our various audits now throughout our business units throughout the year, we actually just send auditors to our HICS portal where they can log in and pull up that information themselves. And since then, we've seen a dramatic reduction in the issues that we've had. So that was one of the big reasons for HICS. We do business with about 12,000 suppliers throughout the year, and supplier information changes, names changes, tax ID change, payment addresses. This has been an issue again in the past, where as suppliers update payment addresses, that's not always communicated consistently to our business units. So we have issues with payments going to the wrong locations. And, unfortunately, we've had issues with, bad actors, trying to change payment address. So we have had a number of cases throughout the years of fraud. And with a solution like HICS, what we do is we require suppliers update their information themselves in the portal. So they have to authenticate in, they have to submit that information, that change request, and at that point we can validate it. And we believe that this has had certainly a reduction in some of the fraudulent activities around payment addresses. Similar to what Adam mentioned, we actually use supplier messaging quite a bit. We have succeeded at getting our active suppliers centralized in a single solution, which is HICS. We do have suppliers maintain their contact information throughout the year. And when we have events such as COVID or natural disasters, we have the ability to, in a single place, mass communicate with our supply chain, on certain steps that they need to take, to protect themselves or assist us. An example, we had a facility a few years ago that experienced a massive flood, due to some heavy rains, and that facility was flooded. All of the supplier information was housed in the buyer desk. Nobody could get access to the facility, and therefore there was no way to communicate with the suppliers to tell them to stop shipping to the facility. Now you fast forward with HICS, we have all of those supplier records in one place. We have all the supplier contacts in one place, and HICS provides us the ability to mass message, to where if that occurred today, we can send them a message, with instructions on what to do. So, those are just a few examples of how, we've been able to take advantage of a solution like HICS.
And in terms of having data centralized in one place, what has this brought to the table?
Yeah, so if we look at some of the functions within onboarding, we have quality that collects all of their quality certifications, manages that information through HICS. Similar to EDF, we have, different sectors within the U.S. that do a wide variety of things, such as, ship repair and ship manufacturing, electronics, services businesses. They all have their own, requirements around safety and health, counterfeit parts, small business reporting. Again, we can collect that information consistently through our predefined requirements and workflows. Accounts payable, about a year and a half ago, took advantage of HICS and deployed an invoicing portal. So they recognized that, HIX was the only solution we have within BAE that has all of our suppliers in one place. And they basically worked with HIX to create an invoice portal where suppliers can log in with their existing credentials that they used for the procurement side of the process. And they can go to an invoicing tab and, self-serve on invoice and remittance payments. That has had a tremendous impact for accounts payable. They've, basically achieved a 5-year business case in 1 year. They've deflected, I think, 35% of all calls that come into their shared services team each day. Once you can, get your supplier information consolidated, as we've done with HIX, the doors just open up on other opportunities.
Fantastic. So, Kostas, a question to you then on hearing some of those responses there. What for you are some of the most exciting use cases that stand out here?
Yeah, I think what stands out is, and also knowing both these businesses quite well over the years, is how many different things they have per business unit, right? It is like 5 or 10 different businesses, and they are vastly different between one another. So it's being able to do tailored activities at scale, right? That's the point, in a consistent, repeatable manner. It's having very strong controls, right? You've been able to lock down the ERP in both instances, so that means that there is a single entry point. And I know, again, nuclear and defense, 2 of the most highly regulated kind of environments, right? So you would need strong controls. So, and I love the idea of properly engaged, I think, supply chain teams and I'd say supplier communities, right? It is pretty unique what both have achieved, that many struggle with this idea of enablement and portals and all these things. Not to say that it happened overnight, but once you have this central pool, it's phenomenal the amount of efficiency you get over your supplier community. And again, things which would have taken a very long time and to have great data, now they're able to do that in a very efficient way, right? Even the COVID response, I think I had other conversations with Jerry. That was, one person quickly sending out an email versus, tons of procurement people having to pound the phones and figure out who do I call and is this information up to date and all these things. So high quality data and efficient as well.
Yes, so that point around efficiency is something that we'll pick up on a little bit later as well. Now, of course, both EDF and BAE represent strong examples of organisations that have invested very much in getting supplier information management right. But thinking more generally now, perhaps, some anecdotes that you've heard or experiences from a past life. My first question is to you, Jerry. What examples have you seen where bad supplier data on the flip side has caused substantial issues?
Yeah, I think one example is around spend analytics. And to be honest, this was an area that we struggled a bit with, prior to HIX. But again, being a business, of several different ERP systems, in the past, as we would collect information and enter that into our various systems, that information would be entered in an inconsistent way. And without integration, some of it was, entered incorrectly. Our ERP systems downstream feed a number of systems that do a number of things, but one of them is, a data warehouse where we do spend analytics. We do have, I think around 30% of our suppliers are common to more than one of our business units. Therefore, prior to HIX, again, that information was fed downstream into our data warehouses inconsistently. So when you try to do spend across your suppliers that don't have, the same names or the same addresses or the same tax IDs, because of the way that information was entered into your ERPs, it's very difficult to be able to roll up spend to see what you're spending with some of your large suppliers. And of course, we use that information, when we do our negotiations. We have a number of, senior leaders that interact directly with their congressional districts. They like to take that information with them to show how much BAE is spending in a particular district. And again, if you don't have good data, in your ERPs that are feeding systems downstream, it's the bad data in, bad data out scenario. So, I think that's one area, that we've seen a lot of improvement on. We now have, again, we have that single entry point. We have integration with our ERP systems, so it's fed consistently, and then that's fed consistently downstream. I mentioned the fraudulent payments. Again, a business our size, when suppliers or bad actors are reaching out to their individual buyers across the various business units, without a way to validate who you're speaking with, they take that information, they make the changes, and then a month later you realize you just made a fraudulent payment. So now we have a consistent method, a consistent control around who can provide that data, how that data is reviewed, and then until it's reviewed, it's not put into the ERP system. So I think that's certainly another area, where not having a good supplier management process, let alone system, I think can cause some challenges.
And Adam, from hearing that, does any of that resonate with you from experience that you've had within the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. And from what Jerry's saying, it sounds like BAE are several steps ahead of what we're doing in some of this stuff as well. And I aspire to be doing some of the things you talked about there, Jerry. In companies that I've worked for previously, supplier onboarding, in some cases, is simply a way of paying a supplier's invoice. So an invoice comes in, it's a supplier that's not currently listed in the ERP. So accounts payable say, great, okay, so we'll list them so we can pay this invoice. And therefore, you as a supply chain team, you have very little control over use of suppliers. Your tail spend goes through the roof. And it's very difficult to manage your supply base or ensure some sort of a cohesive strategy towards your suppliers. And put simply, EDF just couldn't operate like that. Our requirements of our suppliers and the risks that we manage, as Jerry said with BAE systems, it just wouldn't be possible for EDF to work in that sort of environment. I've also seen some of the larger source to pay systems and what they can offer as far as SIM is concerned. And frankly, I think they would struggle to do what we do in HICS with the licensing of suppliers to work in our different business units with different requirements and different regulation and all that sort of stuff. So as I said, I was delighted when I walked into EDF and saw that a lot of what is needed is already there, and that is because, as Costa said, the longevity and the partnership that we've had with HICS, working alongside you guys to set all this stuff up. Yes, we've got a lot to work on. We've still got some things we need to improve on, even in the supplier risk area. I'd like to think that we've got some really good things in place for supplier onboarding, but we now need to start thinking about the longevity of the contracts and making sure that stuff's updated and current always. And the trend these days is to get further down into your supply chain as well, not just the suppliers that you're directly contracted with. So again, that's an area that we need to be working with HICS on getting right. And even this morning, talking to your team about what's coming around further integrations with sources of data like EcoVadis and Rapid Ratings and companies like that, will all help for us to strengthen that flow of data into our system and manage our suppliers in that way.
So, Costas, I'm interested to know your view now in terms of some of the comments we've just heard there, particularly around perhaps some of the data issues. And are enough people aware, do you think, of the wider issues that can be caused?
I think are enough people aware? That's a challenging one. My view tends to be this is a procurement or organizational maturity, but I think the awareness has grown in recent years with the idea of digitalization. Historically, my view has been that procurement and supply chain teams maybe have not wanted to take ownership of the vendor master. So I would say again, teams here were sort of leading the pack. Now this has changed because I think the fundamental thing you miss if you are not taking control of your supply information master data, fundamentally you can't really digitalize these processes, right? They all are running off of data, right? If you look at any risk process, any sustainability, any environmental program, if you look at all these programs, right, quality, etc., they all fundamentally require you to have good supplier data before you're able to run them efficiently and effectively. So in this day and age, that's an inability to digitalize for the procurement and supply chain functions is what I think has elevated this awareness.
And Jerry, as Adam mentioned, there's always work to do. It's an ongoing process. But I'd be interested to know, what are some of the further initiatives that you've now been able to start on, or some of the things that you're looking to do next?
We knew that once we got, our suppliers consolidated in a single system, that opportunities to further expand what we do, would present themselves. Now that we're at that point of having all of our suppliers in one place, just a number of functions are approaching us on a number of things that they want to do. As a few examples, the centralization of proprietary information agreements or non-disclosure agreements. This is an area where, we're always asking ourselves, do I have an NDA with that supplier before I can interact with them? And well, I don't know, where would it be? So we're looking to, to centralize all of our non-disclosure agreements in one place. Again, we have a number of services businesses where we have a lot of suppliers that come on site to either our shipyards or into some of our services buildings to do work, and we have to vet U.S. persons. So what we start to do now is collecting all of that vetting information in HICS, and then having our security facilities around our business locations log into HICS when a supplier shows up at their site to look to see if we have current information on them. And if not, they go over to a PC that's right there and they fill it out. So again, one place to collect information, and then one place for all of our various, security personnel to go to pull up that information. Insurance certificates, again, we require suppliers for various reasons to provide insurance and proof of insurance through certificates. So we are looking at centralizing all of our insurance certificates online. Sustainability and business continuity, specifically sustainability, BAE has set goals, within the next, 10 to 20 years to be carbon neutral. So we are working with our suppliers diligently to get them on board with that. So we've started to kick off a number of initiatives around sustainability, to find out what they're doing to participate in that. Business continuity, where this kind of pokes at supplier risk in general, is, what are some of the risk out there to our supply chain, and what are we doing to help, ensure that our businesses are aware of those risks and to mitigate those risks. So those are, probably just a few, but I will tell you that, once you reach critical mass with getting, supplier information in one place, the doors really just keep opening on what you can do now.
Well, that's really great to hear. And just as a follow-up to that, for people who are assessing various initiatives for their supplier information management projects, what are your recommendations for making those projects successful? What do you look for?
Well, I mean, a couple of things come to mind. I mean, much like probably, BAE and EDF even, I mean, if you are, kind of a complex business, or even just a business that, may struggle with change. I mean, people have been collecting supplier information in a particular way for years, so on top of deploying, HICS and this new process, I mean, this was getting people to change, the way they've done things for years. Stop collecting paper. They like the feel and the look of paper. I get it, but there's a different way of doing things now. There's a better way of doing things. So, we are a complex business. We knew that there were a number of stakeholders that had to be brought into this. So for us, it was making sure that we had, support and agreement from the top down. I think that's what made our deployment successful, is that, we literally went right to the very top, the CEO, and, pitched the benefits of doing this, and then worked down through the leadership structures within each of the functions: procurement, quality, safety, health, got everyone on board, and then they brought in the teams that actually, did the work. So I think one is just make sure that you've got, a clear goal, you've got clear support, you've got the right stakeholders involved to ensure that you can get, all the support you're going to need in deploying this. I think the other thing, and this is something that we made a mistake on when we deployed HICS, is when it comes time to defining requirements, what you're going to want your suppliers to complete when you're doing, say, a supplier onboarding. Put yourselves in the position of the supplier and, make sure that what you're asking them to do, makes sense. And in other words, we got so excited about this portal that we initially took it as an option to, or advantage to have our suppliers complete all of this stuff, right? I mean, so we basically were asking them to complete all of this information, a lot of which we weren't even doing anything with, right? So when we deployed HICS initially, there was so much that we asked them to do, they wouldn't do it. And then at some point we had to go back and kind of, come to Jesus session, if you will, where, okay, if we're not actually doing something with this information that we're collecting from them, then we're not going to collect it, because at the end of the day, if suppliers don't participate, then this process doesn't work. So just make sure that when you're, defining your requirements on what suppliers are going to need to complete for you, just make sure that, it's, information that you're actually doing something with, and just try to keep it as simple as you can for your suppliers. I mean, at the end of the day, they have how many customers, how many other portals to deal with. If you make it too complex, they may not want to participate.
Excellent. I think some really great advice there. And Adam, I'd be interested to know now, from your perspective, what are the initiatives that you're looking to start working on?
So I've touched on a few of them already a bit earlier, but the UK seems to be quite creative at the moment about coming up with new things for us to monitor and new things for us to incorporate and to deal with. Over the last couple of years, there's been Modern Slavery Act. We're about to go into sort of further regulation around IR35 and all that sort of stuff. Various impacts due to Brexit, export controls and things like that. So we're constantly coming up against new requirements, new potential risks and issues. And HICS just gives us gives us that place to add these new requirements onto, which is a good place to be. Having a really good core structure and then being able just to add new stuff as needed. Sustainability is a massive thing for EDF, as you'd expect, being in the industry that we're in. One of our key policies at the moment is helping Britain achieve net zero, and we can only do that with the help of our suppliers. So that again is something that we're going to be looking to expand on quite rapidly over the next couple of years. Getting into proper supplier performance management as well is something that we don't really formalize right now, but it's something that we could formalize a lot more within HICS and will need to. So there's lots of things that we are sort of looking to add on to the suite of functionality we currently use. But as I said earlier, I mean, one of the key things to do, we've got some very clever people in our business that are very focused on specific risks around what we do and what we do with our suppliers. So for me personally, one of the key areas I want to get right is to make sure that they are brought in and provide their expertise in the right circumstances and at the right time. Because if we're not bringing their expertise in, if we're not asking them the right questions, we could be making mistakes and missing things that we shouldn't be missing. So for me, we've had some really good success and collaboration in the areas of data risk and financial risk and financial crime. There's other areas that we haven't started talking to yet, but we will do very shortly because they're equally important. And as I said earlier, we're very focused at the moment on supplier onboarding, which is really important. We need to make sure that we're working with the right suppliers, but these things change over time. So definitely need to be looking for a more ongoing approach to this and making sure that we do lift the lid on these suppliers or revisit those suppliers. Financial crime, for example, we run it through a tool and we get the results, but that's only a snapshot in time. So we do need to repeat that periodically to make sure that nothing changes. And as I say, because of the way that the supply chain are engaged and involved in the process, and the way that we're bringing in those specialist areas, we've got some very clear models to be able to replicate that across other areas than we do at the moment.
And you mentioned, Adam, the keyword success there. So I'd be interested to know, what are the key ingredients that you look for a successful SIM project? What are your recommendations when scoping some of these initiatives?
Well, I think, as we've said a few times, it very much depends on the complexity of your organization. I think in EDF and BAE, you've got two examples of organizations that are complex and have very different requirements and are very highly regulated. So for us, I can't imagine us going to any less of a supplier information system because we just couldn't take the risk of what's there. But I think the other thing for me, which is an absolute get right, is the way that we work with those suppliers that are listed, making use of the portal, as Jerry's mentioned a few times there. It's all very easy to gather the right information at source when you're setting a supplier up. 2 or 3 years down the line, when they've had different people looking after us as a client, their details change, and let's face it, if you're leaving your job, the chances of you remembering to update the 20 different customer systems with the fact that you're leaving and someone else is taking over. So for me, that's one of the key get rights, is how do you maintain that data going forwards, and how do you motivate those suppliers to keep their details updated in a system that is probably not at the forefront of their minds all the time.
That's a really good point there. So Costas, a bit of a big question then to end on here, but we've heard a number of thoughts now on areas such as sustainability. The quotation from Jerry previously about putting yourself in the position of the suppliers or keeping it simple for suppliers. What are some of your thoughts about near-term trends in supplier information management?
Yeah, so I think a lot has been covered here, but I can reiterate that programs like risk and sustainability and performance, these are key. I think it's also important to know that customers are looking at addressing them in different ways, particularly around performance. So that's probably a different conversation. I think customer of choice, COVID has brought that to light, right? It's easy to to feel that you can pressure squeeze a supplier when supply is abundant, so to speak. But as soon as supply is constrained, a lot of companies felt that we want to be prioritized, and how do we make sure that we are prioritized? And that just led people to look at this idea of customer of choice. I think this theme of looking at suppliers rather than a resource, but as a partner, and collaborating and setting them up for success, and making their life easy, which goes also to Jerry's point. I love the point around put yourself in your supplier's shoes, because that is the logical way to do it. But yeah, so prioritizing the supplier experience so you can be customer of choice is a huge theme, which we think is going to grow dramatically. The idea of resilience and next level deep into the supply chain is also a resounding theme, and something we are looking to work with EDF on, because we have seen a big demand for such capabilities from a variety of customers. Again, I think COVID has kind of led to this these kind of themes that we need to have visibility, we need to be agile, and we need to make sure that we're doing whatever we can to set up our suppliers for success, so they will be prioritizing us, when it comes down to it.
Well, a great point to end on there. I think a lot of food for thought from this session, a lot of great examples throughout, and great advice as well. So we're at the end of the session today, so thank you very much to the panel. Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Jerry. And thank you for taking the time to listen in today. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and see you next time.